Yeah, good evening. My name's John, and this is God and Beer, and we'll begin with a prayer. Now, I've just been informed, I didn't know this, but it's the anniversary of the Battle of Vienna, which was a really important event in Christian history, and in honour of Our Lady, who is credited with that victory, we'll say a Hail Mary. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Our Lady of Victory, pray for us. Okay, so for God and Beer this month, it was inspired by the recent Australian Census, the results of which, I believe it was done a year ago, but the results came out a couple of months ago, and there was a significant decline in the number of Christians that the number of Australians that identify as Christian, whereas in previous censi, not sure if I got the plural right there, it was something like 70-80%, and even higher if you go back further. But in the most recent census, it had gone down to around 50% of Australians identifying as Christian. Big decline. And there was a number of newspaper articles along the lines of, look, Christianity's dying. It's a dying religion. It's a dying force. It's on the way out. It's not going to be around much longer. Don't worry, everyone. Christianity's nearly gone. Kind of a gleeful tone in a lot of these articles, especially if you were reading the ABC or listening to the ABC. And it reminded me of a really great book, probably the best book I've ever read, by G.K. Chesterton, The Everlasting Man. Really good book. And in that book he talks about what he calls the 5 deaths of Christianity. And he says, Christianity's died a number of times. But just as its enemies are patting the grave after they've killed it, buried it, patting the grave, they're astonished to find that it's appeared somewhere else. It's sprung up alive somewhere else. And he also said, having Christianity die, it's not such a big problem because we have a God who knows his way out of the grave. So anyway, that's sort of got me thinking about this idea of, let's say Christianity is falling away in Australia and it is declining, as it certainly appears to be if you look at numbers. What does that mean? What's that going to mean for Australia? What's that going to mean for Christianity in Australia? What's that going to mean for Australia itself, for our institutions, for our culture? And when I thought about who might be a good person to speak about that, Kevin Donnelly was one of the first people I thought of, because he's been thinking and studying and writing about that very topic for many years. He's written a number of books and edited a number of books on that idea, and also spoken about it in many talks and other public appearances. So here's Kevin Donnelly to speak to us about... I should tell you a little bit more about Kevin.
No, you don't have to.
He's a former teacher, which is really a great thing, because I'm a teacher as well. So tells you what a clever man he is. He's also worked as an educational consultant, and I mentioned he's an author. He's currently an academic at Australian Catholic University, and he also works part-time as a culture warrior. So here's Kevin Donnelly. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, John. Well, I assume you can hear me down the back. That's okay? Good. So thank you very much for the invitation to talk tonight, and thank you for all of you coming out on what turned out to be a bit of a cold, wintry night. But there's a lot to cover, and it's a huge topic. But what I'll try and do is just give you an idea of where I've been thinking and researching and writing over the last 30, 40 years. I mean, John is right. Just as an aside, the census talked about the significant decline in people identifying as Christian. But in the same census, one of the things people didn't really talk about, because they didn't want to, is that if you look under health, under health, and the most common illness people suffered, it was mental illness, anxiety, depression, mental illness. I mean, I get asthma, and it beats asthma, it beats cancer, it beats heart issues. And it just struck me when I read that it was a significant indicator of where society is going. And the other statistic was, I think there are over 1 million single-parent families. Now, I grew up in Broadmeadows, it was Housing Commission. Dad was an alcoholic, he shot through. Mum had to try and raise us. So I know what it's like to have to be in a family where your dad has shot through. But over 1 million families are single parent, mostly women. And again, that worried me, because as somebody who's been married for nearly 50 years and has a loving wife and children, I really do believe that marriage is an institution that is fundamental to our society, certainly within the Christian tradition. But anyway, the argument when the census came out was that Christianity, people argue we live in a post-Christian age, that God is no longer with us. But one of the things that struck me over the last few years, getting involved in the culture wars, as they call it, is that if you look at Western culture, if you look at Australia, Christianity underpins and enriches our way of life, our institutions, our history, our culture, our literature, our music. So in fact, every day, whether you know it or not, because we live in a country, thank God, not in communist China, or not under Putin in Russia, or not in the Ukraine being attacked. We live in a country which is relatively peaceful and prosperous. And I'd argue, as I will explain in a bit more detail, that is because of the Christian, the New Testament in particular. Larry Seidentrop, some of you might know, wrote a book, The Origins of Western Liberalism. And he details in great length how the New Testament really revolutionised ancient Greece and Rome and introduced the idea that we're all made in God's image. And if we are, we all deserve justice, respect, the inherent right to freedom and liberty. The Bible tells us there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. So if you accept that, as we do, that is what has informed our political, our legal systems for over hundreds of years. And I'll talk about the national curriculum a bit later, but one of the things that struck me when I reviewed the national curriculum in 2014 is that there's no mention that slavery was abolished by William Wilberforce and the Christians in England. And in fact, the Royal Navy spent years trying to enforce that in the Mediterranean and around the world. So in the curriculum, there's nothing about how significant Christianity is in ensuring those freedoms and liberties we take for granted. There's a very good academic in Perth called Augusto Zimmerman, who's written one of the chapters in cancel culture. And he explains in some detail that if you go back to Magna Carta in English history and the Glorious Revolution, it was Christianity that really informed what was happening. And it struck me that if you listen to King Charles III in his speech, I think it was even yesterday, he actually said, "I pray for the help and guidance of Almighty God." And when you look at the coronation of the monarch, we all see the secular version, but after that there is a religious version where the monarch has to swear allegiance to God and God's word. And as Augusto writes in his chapter in the book, it's the beginning of that Christian influence on our political, our legal system, that most young people, even older people, don't appreciate or understand because it's not taught, and it hasn't been taught for many years. Christianity is a foundation stone, and there's no denying that. Again, evidence, if you look at the preamble to the Constitution, it calls on, well, it states, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God. So it's in our preamble, in our Constitution. Our parliaments around Australia, except for the ACT, which I think is more a local government authority, our governments around Australia begin with the Lord's Prayer. And I know the Greens and some others want to abolish that, but the fact is it begins with the Lord's Prayer because the fathers of federation, and I'm happy to use that expression, most of them were Christian men. And that's what they believed, that a society, a new nation, would have to call on the blessing of Almighty God. I taught literature for many years in secondary school, which I loved, until it was destroyed by critical theory and postmodernism and deconstruction and identity politics and all the rest of it. But if you look at literature in particular, and Peter Craven talks about this in another one of the chapters, Christianity underpins the best of our literature. And he writes, I'll quote him, "It would be a sad thing if our culture lost its sense of the Judeo-Christian tradition which has shaped it and by whose light it has often had the abiding sense of direction, a faith to affirm, a symbology to draw strength from, a deep sense of the mystery." As I say, I taught literature, but if you're talking about art or music, even architecture, Christianity has had a profound effect. If you look at literary works, and many of you would have your own favourites, but I remember as a kid listening to Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, Dante's Divine Comedy, I tried to read last year. It is a bit difficult, but well worth preserving with. But if you look at the Pilgrim's Progress, Divine Comedy, Milton's Paradise Lost, Shakespeare's tragedies, more recent works, Dostoevsky, T.S. Eliot, of course, Patrick White, Tim Winton, they all reference Christianity. And it amazes me over the last week, there's been a new series, I think Amazon Prime, drawing on J.R. Tolkien. And I can't remember the name, it's not Lord of the Rings, it's a sort of a prequel before all of that. But when Tolkien was asked what motivated him or informed his decision to write Lord of the Rings, he said, quote, "The Lord of the Rings is of course fundamentally religious and Catholic, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision." And it's something you never hear, even though it's been on TV, on movies, on networks. The latest one is the most expensive series ever made, over $1 billion when they put it all together. But nobody acknowledges that Christian foundation. But if you read literature, I'm sure a lot of you do, you know that literature at its best deals with moral and spiritual dilemmas, sin, temptation, guilt, redemption, atonement. I mean, things that are fundamental to society, but increasingly people aren't aware of, or why it's so important. I mean, to talk about atonement or redemption in this time of Twitter and social networking, and where the immediate response is to be vindictive or to vilify or attack, it's obvious that, again, society has lost that moral compass, that foundation that only Christianity can bring, especially the New Testament. Despite all its benefits and strengths, many of you would know, if you go back to the French Revolution, since then it's been a time when Christianity has been attacked. And as John mentioned, there are periods even before then, with the foundation of Christianity in Europe, where it was attacked. But especially since the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, this absolutist secular ideology, he's not a cardinal yet, he should be. Archbishop Fisher in Sydney calls it an absolutist secular ideology. It's very radical. Since the time of the French Revolution, when churches were ransacked, destroyed, nuns, priests were killed or exiled, the church has been under attack. Nietzsche famously wrote, "God is dead." And so what we're now experiencing through our lifetime has been there for many years. More recently, after Nietzsche, Karl Marx argued religion is the opium of the masses. And some of you might know the Italian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, who really is one of the high priests of socialism and communism. Gramsci wrote, "Socialism will be the religion destined to kill Christianity." So he wrote that during the Second World War when he was imprisoned by Mussolini. He was the head of the Italian Communist Party. But his view was that communism would become the new religion. And we see that more recently in what I call cancel culture and political correctness and being woke, as they call it. Marxism is dedicated to achieving a man-made utopia on this earth. There is no afterlife, there is no world to come, and any sense of the spiritual or transcendent is banished. And to talk about your father, I met him, thankfully, many years ago, B.A. Santa Maria, when Archbishop Pell was in Melbourne. And he said to me at the time, "Kevin," because Dad was a communist, my father, and Mum was a good Catholic, he said, "Kevin, you've understood two of the most powerful forces in the 20th century. You've got an experience of communism and the Word of God," which was an interesting childhood. It was confession and communion on Sunday, and then Stalin, Lenin, Marx on Tuesday. But it taught me a lot. And when I was at university, I did postgrad, and I made sure I studied, when I did the PhD, I studied with Doug White, who was an avowed Marxist, the old-fashioned, and I respected him. He was upfront. He actually believed in real education, that you actually sit kids down and teach them. And I learned a lot about communism and Marxism. More recently, I've come across an Italian philosopher, Augusto Del Noce, who I think is one of the most prescient and impressive thinkers and writers of the last 40 or 50 years. But Del Noce, when he details about or talks about Marxism, he compares it to Machiavelli and the belief that the end will always justify the means. And Del Noce wrote, under socialism or communism, every kind of violence, every illegal action, every deception becomes licit if they are deemed to be necessary to reach the goal. And if you've read the Black Book of Communism, you'd know that under Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Pol Pot, over 94 million people have been killed. It just staggers me that there was a survey a couple of years ago by the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney, where they interviewed millennials, and I don't want to offend any young people here, but one of the survey questions was, what would you prefer, communism or democracy? And about 54% said, well, democracy, why would you bother? We prefer socialism. And I suppose it's part of that mentality of big government, having everything provided. I was talking before about Europe and what's happening in the Ukraine and historically after the war in Eastern Europe. A lot of my generation who were born in Australia, a lot of our children have no understanding, or unless it's taught in school, and unfortunately it hasn't been taught, it isn't being taught. But if you've read George Orwell's Animal Farm in 1984, you know that communism, socialism, is totalitarian. It promises a utopia, a workers' paradise, but all it ever provides is tyranny and suffering and death. Now, why am I talking about communism and socialism and Marxism? Good question. The reason I go back to that is because I was at university during the late 60s and early 70s, and it was the time of a cultural revolution, whether it was Vietnam moratoriums, Germaine Greer, the pill, feminism, the slogan make love, not war, which people took literally back then. There was this whole change in academia and society, and people talk about critical theory, whether it's radical feminism, postmodernism, deconstructionism, this is a mouthful, LGBTQI+, some of you would know what that means, I hope.
The alphabet soup. The alphabet bar.
Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex plus. There's a plus because every month there's another category because it's fluid and dynamic, and it's simply a matter of self-identifying. Post-colonial theory is also very big. That's why they're defacing Churchill's statue in London, Captain Cook in Sydney. That's why the national curriculum talks about studying Indigenous algebra, which I find a bit quirky, because I kind of remember algebra being Pythagoras and Euclid and going back to the Greeks, but post-colonial theory is very big at the moment. And it's very important to understand that this more recent movement of political correctness, cultural left ideology, actually draws on what happened 60, 70, 80 years ago. So if you go back to the Frankfurt School in Germany during the 1920s, when a lot of academics realised there would never be a revolution in the West, the way to overthrow the West was to take the long march through the institutions, which some of you would know the expression. And that drew on Gramsci and people like Althusser and Bourdieu. And it's been very effective. So what I argue in a number of the books over the last 5-10 years is that what we're currently experiencing, this cultural revolution of being woke, being politically correct, it's not just about being reasonable and fair to people and not being unfairly discriminatory. It actually draws all those years ago back to this kind of cultural left socialist idea that you get rid of Christianity, you cancel the family, you take the long march, through the institutions, whether it's the media, the ABC as an example, obviously, whether it's family, same-sex marriage, whether it's intermediary organisations like trade unions, and that was the whole battle that PA fought to stop the communists infiltrating the trade union movement. But what we're currently facing is that Western civilisation, Judeo-Christianity, are constantly attacked. Identity politics prevails. Disadvantaged individuals and groups are presented as victims, powerless, except if you're someone like me, sorry to be offensive, but I'm male, pale and stale. And I was actually I was on a Zoom meeting with a conference, and a young lady, that's how she described me, because I was defending Christianity in Western culture. What do you expect? You're male, pale and stale. I mean, the greatest, if you followed what happened with the Ramsay Centre when they tried to set that up in places like Sydney University. At Sydney Uni, over 150 academics attacked it as being white supremacism, Eurocentric, patriarchal, binary, homophobic, transphobic, blah, 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 blah. There's a whole kind of list that they go through. Even worse than Camille Paglia, I don't know if you know her, she's an American non-binary feminist who I think is great value, Camille Paglia. She's actually very, very sound. And I'll quote her. She talks that we're now living in a time of ethical chaos where intolerance masquerades as tolerance and where individual liberty is crushed by the tyranny of the group. And when I talk about 1984 and Big Brother and the party, that's exactly what we're living through. So whether it's Israel Folau or Margaret Court, even Barry Humphries was cancelled, some of you might know, because he argued that a man will always be a man, even if he self-identifies as a woman. J.K. Rowling is in trouble. We now live in a time when what I was taught, when I did matriculation all those years ago, what I was taught as clear thinking, rational debate, was impartial, objective, you never attack the person. That kind of approach is now long gone, where it really is about vilifying, attacking, making it very personal. And we also have this Orwellian sense of groupthink and mind control. So one of my latest books is The Dictionary of Woke, where I have about 250 words and expressions that you need to know so you don't get into trouble. Because even our schools and universities now have trigger warnings, safe spaces, diversity guidelines, where they tell students and academics that Australia was invaded, that the First Fleet was the arrival of genocide. They say that you can't talk about men and women, that's heteronormative. It's filtered right through. I mean, I was shattered. My niece told me, who's got a little 8-year-old at a school down Mornington Way, they had Purple Day, Purple Ribbon Day, 2 weeks ago, which was to celebrate the LGBTQI plus people. Fine. But they were telling 8-10-year-old boys that they couldn't say, come on boys, let's kick the footy. He couldn't talk to his mates like that. He couldn't use a word like boys or girls. He was 8 years old, nearly 10. He came home, he said, Mum, what's happening at school? Kids Helpline, you might know, even the new guidelines for preschool and kindergarten now tell teachers, if they want government funding, that they have to teach what the government approves as what I call radical gender theory. So this stuff is filtering even down to kids who really, little children, talk about, let children come unto me. Little children, a time of innocence and joy are being, I'd argue, corrupted by this. And another example is the Safe Schools program. Do you know of it? Some of you do? Safe Schools went into schools around Australia about 14 years ago under the banner of teaching tolerance and respect for children who might be gay or lesbian or whatever. In fact, one of the people who wrote it, Ros Ward, she gave a talk at a socialist conference. This is one of the women who wrote Safe Schools. I'll quote her. "Only Marxism provides the theory and practice of genuine human liberation. Safe Schools is about supporting gender and sexual diversity, not about stopping bullying." So this program went into schools around Australia, primary and secondary, funded by Liberal and Labor governments, based on the rationale, according to Ros Ward, that it was to overthrow the Christian concept of family and gender and sexuality, to destroy that and to replace it with the idea that gender, sexuality, it's fluid, it's limitless, it's all about self-identification. And the other example is this more recent one about transgenderism. And I was happy to see in London the clinic Tavistock a couple of weeks ago was shut down. You might not be aware, but in England, America, Europe, Australia, the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a push by the cultural left into schools and among young people to push transgenderism. So if my children, when they were born, are they healthy? Are they well? Is it a boy or a girl? In our hospitals now, they don't say that. You assign a gender at birth. And I never quite work out what that means, assign a gender. I thought it was biologically determined, and I think about 98-99%, and a doctor down the back might help me here, I think about 98-99% of babies are born with chromosomes XX or XY. But the whole radical gender movement is teaching preschool, kindergarten, primary and secondary school kids that it's fluid and limitless. And you just wonder where it leads. The other one I'll quickly mention is the national curriculum that I reviewed in 2014. It covers prep to year 10, all the different subjects, and if you look at that, which we did over some months, there are literally hundreds of references to Indigenous culture, history, spirituality. I think there are 4 or 5 to Christianity. So just stop and think. If it's true that Christianity underpins Western culture, Western society, our political, our legal system, our art, music, literature, as well as the Word of God, giving that sense of faith and trust in life and what is to come, if the national curriculum cancels all of that, you just wonder where we're heading. So, where are we up to? On that note, what's to be done? As BA always said, what's to be done? You can stop looking at the problem, let's work out what the solution is. Now, one is to call out the true nature of what I call cultural left ideology, and to have the courage to be true to one's beliefs and one's faith. So I know it's incredibly difficult for young people, whether at university or school or even at work now. You can lose your job, as those university students, I think there were 3 of them, at a university in Brisbane found out some years ago, they wanted to use a computer. They went into what was called indigenous computers. I didn't know computers were kind of Eurocentric or indigenous, and they got into trouble and they were told to leave. And on Facebook, I think they said, but they were threatened with litigation, they were vilified and attacked. So I know it's difficult because increasingly, and this gets back to George Orwell, the way the cultural left is operating is infiltrating and really infecting our language and the way people think. But we have to fight for what we believe in, reassert the importance of Christianity, as I've tried to give you a brief outline tonight. And you need to do as you're doing now, you need to mobilise. You need to join like-minded individuals and associations and be active in the public square. Now I'm fortunate, even at the ACU, I'm given the time and freedom to be active and to write and research. But I would never be able to get a job at Melbourne University or La Trobe or Monash. Simply, it's a fact. I'd never bother applying. They would never give me a job. And if they did, I would never be able to be published in peer-reviewed journals. I would never get promotion, and I'd be put somewhere out the back away from everyone else. But you need to, and I think it's the Irish Catholic, my father's father came out 1854 from Kings County and actually stole the land around Wagga and helped build the cathedral and the convent. I think there's a bit of that sort of bog Irish blood that comes down through the generations. But I've always believed you have to fight the good fight. The minute you vacate the field, you've already lost. And, you know, it's ironic, I was talking before to people, when Shane Warne died, it was like, oh my, people were grief-stricken. You know, day of mourning, a state funeral. I mean, in Australia, we seem to worship sportsmen and women. But my argument is, no, we need to understand that there are more important things. It's interesting, and I'll try and be, well, I will be a bit more positive. Even the ABC, God bless them, they did a survey, Australia Talks. 68% of those surveyed agreed that political correctness was going too far. So there's kind of a pendulum swinging back, I think. People are beginning to feel this has gone far enough madness, let's reassert common sense. And maybe it was Chesterton who said, we now live in a time when common sense is very uncommon, but we need to re-establish that. And it's interesting, more and more people are, and I'm involved in a conference, one-day conference in Melbourne in a couple of weeks. There are people lighting small fires all around Australia in terms of either supporting or establishing their own Christian schools. Now, whether it's Brisbane, Sydney, Adelaide, Perth, Melbourne, there are communities joining together and establishing schools dedicated to what I call a liberal education or a classical education within the Christian or Catholic tradition. And there's been a significant rise in homeschooling, in Queensland in particular. People are starting to fight back. And if you follow events in America, in Virginia and Florida, recently Republican governors were elected, which was quite unusual. And part of the reason is because families and communities were joining to fight against Black Lives Matter and radical gender theory. So there is a pendulum here. And it's interesting, you know, we started when John talked about the census. While it's true in Europe, Australia, America, Christianity might be on falling away, it's the fastest growing religion in the world at the moment, especially in Africa and Asia. So there's a rebirth here happening around the world, people are searching for the Word of God. And I'll finish with, some of you would know Julian of Norwich, who I think is a very profound thinker. In times of grief or sorrow, or times of feeling a little bit anxious, I remember her words. And actually T.S. Eliot used her words as well in 4 quartets. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. So hopefully with God's grace and faith, that will be true. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. We've got a little bit of time for some questions. If anyone would like to ask Kevin a question, we might just get you to stand up and call it out in a loud voice rather than move the microphone around, if that's okay.
Otherwise, I can come and buy some books.
Kevin, you talked about your own situation and that you would never apply for a job at a university because they would turn their back, etc., because your philosophy and ideas would be the antithesis of the current educational university. And you also spoke about how there are small communities in Australia where schools are being formed in the Christian tradition. Would I be right in thinking that those small schools would have nothing to do with the Catholic education bureaucracy, because these bureaucracies are, in some instances, fundamentally anti-Catholic and ignorant of the Western Christian traditions and history and art and science that you spoke about? I'm just interested whether those small communities would allow the Catholic education bureaucracies to run their show.
The short answer is no. They want to be outside either the government or the non-government system. I mean, the Catholic schools are systemic, most of them, and these parents want the flexibility and freedom to really structure their own school according to what they see as worthwhile and valuable. Now, I know it's a vexed issue, and I know Archbishop Pell, when he was in Melbourne, tried to turn some of that around within the Catholic schools, but it's a huge job. And part of the reason is that, I don't know, I'll make it up, maybe 80-90% of teachers in Catholic schools are not of the faith. And they've been educated in secular universities. And that in itself is a problem, because they don't live the faith. So when they're teaching, it's not obvious to them. And that really means that if you're a parent, you'd have to be very selective in where your kid went to school. Or you need to do a lot more at home, which I think is starting to happen. One over here.
You mentioned the Tavistock Clinic. It's interesting, a few months ago when that story broke, I gave it a few weeks and then searched the ABC website. Not a single mention, not a word. In fact, it was so bad I just checked it now and I realised the only mention on the ABC website is actually their Newswatch program, which outed them because it was so egregious that they hadn't said a word about it. But that is a taxpayer-funded entity, arguably chartered to be unbiased. So I maybe just your reflections, but the fact that we can't even seem to hold almost a statutory body to account that is required to be unbiased, this challenge that we have with the media generally. I just note how challenging a time we're in, and if you've got any in terms of the future, any thoughts for how that might be addressed?
No, it's a fundamental issue. I sometimes appear on Sky News, and I generally write for the Murdoch Press, Herald Sun, Daily Telegraph, Australian. The Age won't publish me, Sydney Morning Herald won't. So that's an issue, and the ABC, Virginia Trioli doesn't like me for some reason. But there are avenues, obviously. The whole new digital media provides a way around that. And that's one thing that some of you, I'm sure, are aware of, that you can use the media to do what is best. The other problem, and I'll just mention this, it staggers me in Victoria under Chairman Dan, as I call him, and I now describe where the people don't follow this but think carefully. Victoria is now the Antipodean Venezuela. So Venezuela, third-rate totalitarian bankrupt state, we're it in Victoria, the Antipodean Venezuela. They legislated to stop parents, priests, health professionals counselling against transgenderism. So the very thing that Tavistock got into trouble for, and the very report that they tabled in England, criticising the affirmative action approach, now it's legislated in Victoria. So if you're a parent or a priest, even telling a young person that there are consequences if you take puberty blockers and have radical surgery, given a lot of these young people after some time regret what they've done, even to suggest you should stop and think, you can be fined or put in jail. Now that's how serious the problem is, and that's what deeply concerns me. Luckily I'm older, and my daughter lives interstate, and it's not as bad where she is, but it just staggers me. It's like, you know, I ran a seafood business for a while, a small shop in Melbourne, Edsall Street, and the expression, it was very cruel, but you know, if you boil a lobster, it takes a while for the lobster to realise it's in deep trouble. It's kind of like Victoria at the moment, that incrementally we've lost our liberties and freedoms, and that became obvious during COVID, during the lockdowns. But it was so like people were inured to it, desensitised to it, that nobody spoke up. And it just staggers me. And that for me gets back to the whole idea of Big Brother, groupthink, language control, that Orwellian sense. And this is where Chairman Dan is a consummate political operator. And he plays that game every day, every week, every month, to the extent, and I don't want to offend people, but when it came out, the report that 33 people had died because of the ambulance trouble, he disappeared for 3 or 4 days. And then when he came back, sincere, regretful, sorry, oh, my son was crook on the weekend, I had to look at... I mean, that kind of, you think, wow, how does he have the gumption or gall to do that? But he gets away with it. But anyway, that's enough of politics.
Kevin, that was incredibly offensive. I am literally shaking.
I need to be re-educated.
We need to get you to a re-education camp stat. Mate, for a pale male stale individual, that was that was very. I think that was very helpful, Kevin, helping us understand some of the reasons we've gotten into this mess, and hopefully give us a little bit of hope that maybe there's a way out. Although I think C.S. Lewis said something along the lines of, we don't believe in Christianity because it's useful, because it creates a great society and it makes things work well, it creates great outcomes. That's not why we believe in it. We believe in it because it's true. But the fact that it has all these, that it creates this beautiful culture and creates so many great things in the world, hospitals, universities, schools and so on, that certainly doesn't hurt, does it? It's one of the great benefits of Christianity. And I think what you've shown us here tonight is how crucial Christianity is to our culture, to our society. So thank you. And although you may be a stale pale male, the people at the Knot here have assured me that their pale ale is not stale. So make sure you enjoy that.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Now please do, after, we've just got a couple of announcements. After that, please do head up to the table there where Kevin's got some of his books on sale. I've read a couple of those just recently and they are excellent, very entertaining, very worthwhile. So see Kevin for a copy of one of his books. Now we've got a couple of donation buckets which are going to come around. Andrew, would you mind grabbing those buckets and just pass them around? They're just coming around. Now the God and Beer event is totally free, so there's no obligation to donate anything, but it does help us to put on the event, helps us with some of the costs of doing it. So we're very grateful if anyone is able to donate. Thank you. A few quick announcements. The next Garden Beer is in 1 month, and it's October the 10th, second Monday of the month as usual, and the speaker will be Tim Staples from the USA. Tim is I would say world famous Catholic apologist. He's been travelling the world giving talks about the Catholic faith, explaining it for several decades, and he's going to be here right in this room at the Notting Hill Hotel in 1 month giving this talk on renewing the church. So I highly recommend coming along to that. I'm pretty sure that event we will have to shut off the registrations at some point because I think we'll probably fill up. So if you would like to come, please register early. And that's going to be a really great night. So come along to next month's God and Beer. Tim Staples from the USA, from Catholic Answers, renewing the church. As well as that, we've got another bonus God and Beer. Have you got the slide for that, Andrew? Yeah, which is a bonus garden beer. So normally we do garden beer once a month, but there was an opportunity to have this guy, Professor Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford University. He's out here in Australia next week, and he's only here for a few days in Australia. He's giving a series of talks and doing a lot of media and meeting with politicians relating to, and his expertise is in the pandemic because he's an epidemiologist and an economist. And he's going to be, doing public events with the likes of Tony Abbott, John Anderson, and Rowan Dean. He's going to be all over the media next week. But we've been able to get him to come here to the Knot. And he's going to give this talk, A Christian Response to the Pandemic, where it turns out Jay himself is a Christian, as well as being a world-leading epidemiologist from Stanford University. He's most famous for authoring the Great Barrington Declaration along with Harvard University and Oxford University academics. And basically, he's going to talk about how some of the mistakes that were made during the pandemic response. Okay, some of the ways in which things went a bit crazy and we actually might have caused a bit more damage with the way we responded to it than the pandemic itself. So he's going to speak about that. He's an amazing guy. He was brought in by both President Trump and Ron DeSantis in the USA to help them craft their pandemic response. And yeah, that's going to be something really special. So that's next week on Wednesday night. So what's that, 9 days from now? That'll be here at the Knot. Can you just grab the other slide, Andrew? Yeah, so for this one, to book tickets for that event, it's a paid event. It's $20 a head to come along. You need to go to drjinoz.com and you'll find there's a few events there, and the Wednesday night is the one where he'll be here at the Notting Hill Hotel next Wednesday. So I hope you can make it to that. That'll probably also sell out, so I would get in quick if you'd like to come. Okay, nearly done. Just one or two more. So God and Beer, as you know, is an initiative of the Knights of the Southern Cross. It's a Catholic men's organisation. And if anyone's interested in joining the Knights of the Southern Cross, please talk to either Andrew, operating the camera here tonight, or Carmen, who's at the front desk. You would have seen him as you came in registering people, or myself. Come and talk to us if you're interested in the Knights. It's a great organisation. I get a lot out of it personally, being involved in it. We do a lot of great stuff, and you get to hang out with great people. Yeah, we've got some flyers at the front that you can grab to find out more. Thank you to the Catholic Development Fund for supporting the God and Beer initiative. And finally, we've got Andrew, who's just going to say a couple of quick things about some upcoming stuff.
Thank you, John. For those who don't know me, my name is Andrew Vaccaro and I'm the State Secretary of the Knights of the Southern Cross Victoria. One of the reasons we didn't hold the God and Beer event in August was because of the flagship event of the Knights of the Southern Cross Victoria, which is the Archbishop's Dinner for the Priest Support and Education Fund. And I just wanted to give a brief rundown of what happened on Friday, August the 19th. So after 3 long years, finally the Knights of the Southern Cross Victoria Archbishop's Dinner came back to Moonee Valley Racecourse. And what a 3 years it had been. No one ever would have thought that as the last year in August 2019 concluded that we would have to have waited so long to return, but we did. For a time it felt like an unreachable goal, but it was reached in the end. And for all of that, $86,000 was raised for the education of Victoria's seminarians. On Friday, August 19th, saw just on 400 people attending the flagship event, Knights of the Southern Cross, in support of the education of our seminarians of the 4 dioceses of Victoria, studying at Corpus Christi College Seminary in Carlton, and those studying for the Catholic Military Ordinariate of Australia to become chaplains in the Australian Defence Force. People from all areas and organisations of the Victorian Catholic Church were in attendance, many having waited a long 3 years to see each other again. All in attendance enjoyed a great night of proceedings, which saw a number of acknowledgements and presentations, with recent priestly ordinations and milestone ordination anniversaries recognised. The night also saw the presentation of 2 bursaries to 2 seminarians for a trip to the Holy Land, which would normally be presented at the official launch of the dinner at the seminary on Pentecost Sunday. This year, due to the slow return of international travel, it was decided to present them on this night. Also featured as part of the fundraising activities were a raffle, a maid and silent auctions. The guest speaker for the night was past Australian Catholic University Vice-Chancellor Professor Emeritus Greg Craven, who spoke on the proposed Indigenous Voice to Parliament, with a vote of thanks given by our guest speaker tonight, Dr Kevin Donnelly. One of the main presentations of the night was the acknowledgement of one of the Priest Support and Education Fund Organising Committee's long-time key members, Val Sumner, who entered her Returnal Reward in July 2021. This was the first chance to pay tribute to Val Sumner, with the PSEF Chairman Carmen Miranda, who's in the audience tonight, presenting a tribute vase to her granddaughters. At the end of the night, it was the honour of the State Chairman of the Knights of the Southern Cross Victoria, Mr Paul Mitchell, who's also here tonight, to present the Archbishop of Melbourne, Archbishop Commentators, with a cheque for $86,000, which is split equally between Victoria's diocese and the Military Ordinariate. This was a record amount for the dinner, surpassing the previous best of $85,000 in 2009. This took the overall money raised since the first dinner in 1999 to $1.4 million. Or $1.46 million. For this, many thanks go to all the loyal sponsors, donors, KSC branches and members, and dinner attendees. Many thanks also go to the members of the organising committee who worked hard all year to plan the event. and for all the work they did in the past 2 years without a dinner, where $60,000 was raised in both years. We look forward to attendance for next year's dinner, and if anyone is interested in still making a donation, there are some booking forms from the past dinner which can be also used as donation forms. So if anyone's interested in making a donation to our seminarians, there are some forms up there. As John said, the Knights of the Southern Cross will be holding an information night next Tuesday at 7:30 at St Gerard's Church in Dandenong North. If anybody's interested in finding out what the Knights do or is interested in joining, see Carmen and he'll take names down and we'll give further information. Just some photos. Oh, I should have shown some photos from the Archbishop's dinner. So the first one back there was our State Chairman Paul Mitchell presenting the Archbishop with the cheque for $86,000. There's our guest speaker, Professor Greg Craven, our Pre-Support and Education Fund Chairman, Carmen Miranda, the members and wives of the KSC Dandenong North Branch, many whom you see here tonight and who organised the Golden Beer event. So some more photos. And that's the organising committee of which myself and Carmen are involved, and Joe O'Brien who's here as well. They're the two seminarians who received the bursaries to the Holy Land, so at some stage in the next 12 months they'll be travelling to the Holy Land as part of their seminary formation. And some photos of the dinner itself. There's our guest speaker, Dr Donnelly, with Professor Craven and the Archbishop. So over 400 in attendance on the night. And say it was a wonderful event. Now the only other item I want to promote, just give me for a sec. At the end of September, we have a campaign, 40 Days for Life, which is fighting to stop abortion, or at least be a witness against abortion. Much of it involves staying outside of or praying and staying witness outside of the exclusion zone in the abortion clinic in East Melbourne. The campaign is being organised by Kathy Clubb. Many would know her for her brave witness to faith, going to the High Court for breaking the exclusion zone. So the campaign is starting in the next month, and actually the official launch is on the 18th of September, and the 40 days will go from September the 28th to November 6th. Now the official launch will be in the city on the day, on the 28th, and then for the next 40 days from 8 AM to 8 PM, we're looking for a couple of individuals every hour from 8 AM to 8 PM to stand witness outside the exclusion zone and pray a vigil. Now we have an event on Wednesday night at I think it's at ACU now, and there are a couple of guest speakers there, so if anyone's interested, I have some flyers. The information, the website's on there. Please feel free to take some, and I have a few posters as well. So I would encourage everyone to try and support that great initiative. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Just drawing your attention to the flyers that hopefully are on all the tables. That's got the details about Professor Jay Bhattacharya. Thanks, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the evening, and come and say good day if you'd like. Good night.